Okay, I always have to do that bit like this. Okay, you can't see how stupid my legs look, but it's very nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us. We have a very special guest tonight, a very interesting guy, not only for what we know about him, but for what you probably don't know about him, but we'll talk more about that. So can we give a very special and very warm welcome, please, to the fabulous Matthew Syed. And that's the Chief Executive of the IHM, just arriving late. So everybody say good evening, Jill. Good evening, Jill. That's right. You won't do that again, will you? It's very nice to see you. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to talk to you tonight. But you've got a really interesting backstory. It's people's backstories that interest me the most. You've got is it a Pakistani dad and a Welsh mum?
Yes.
Yeah. So are you Welsh, Pakistani, or British?
Good question. Cosmopolitan, I think, is probably the right answer. Thanks for having me, by the way. Thanks for sponsoring. Thanks for organising. Thanks for coming along. I'm really looking forward to the evening. Yeah, so my background, my father was born in India, in Hyderabad, before the partition, from a Muslim background. So they moved to Pakistan after the partition. He came to London to study law in the 1960s.
That must have been a hell of a thing to do, actually, wasn't it? In those days.
It was a bit. I think that was a very brave step of my father. I mean, something quite unusual happened. He was born a Muslim, converted to Christianity.
That's even more difficult.
Yeah, that was the challenge.
Yeah.
Met my mother at church. They fell in love. It's always inexplicable, one's parents' love to the children, but great marriage anyway. And my older brother was born in 1968, me in 1970, and my sister in 74. And we're a very, really good unit. And I feel, I feel very cosmopolitan. I do feel very strongly. My patriotism has grown as I've got older, in a funny kind of a way. And, I think when I was in my youth, I was a bit suspicious about Union Jack, felt that it didn't necessarily include me and people with darker skin, but I think...
Did you experience any kind of prejudice when you were younger?
Yes. Name-calling at school, and the feeling of being excluded. Whenever I would go into a room, I was vigilant for whether or not I was somebody who would be accepted. And was on the lookout for the warning signs that perhaps I wasn't. So I've become very interested in subconscious racism and implicit biases that can drive quite powerful dynamics, even amongst people who would think of themselves as enlightened. It's often, I think now in today's world, the bigotry is less significant than the implicit biases that can sometimes...
The NHS still suffers with problems. We still have to carve out BME conferences and committees on promoting hugely talented people that we ignore because their skin is a different colour to ours. It's the most infuriating thing. John and I ran a conference on it, and really, it was a dread. It was a real mind-opening day. It was, and the NHS still has all that, and I don't really understand why that is.
Yeah, if one wants to check the power of the subconscious and affecting the way that one draws inferences about what somebody is like on the basis of surface appearances rather than who they really are, it's worth going to the Harvard Implicit Association website, and one can measure one's own subconscious prejudice. I have a bit of it, and it's awareness of it that begins to break it down. I mean, not too long ago, maybe 8 years ago, but this research is still happening today. 5,000 CVs were sent out to American employers with archetypal white names on half of them, like James and Jane, and archetypal black names on the other, like Tyrone and Latoya. The CVs were identical, except for the names. And these were enlightened employers, university-educated people who wouldn't have imagined that they had any prejudice, but the CVs with black names were 50% less likely to be invited to interview. And I think that does create a certain type of dynamic.
Do you know, Matthew, it's really funny because the guest after you next month is Dr. Sir Sam Etherington, who you may have heard his big name in the NHS, and he did exactly that exercise for doctors and nearly got struck off the register for submitting false documents. That's how stupid the NHS can be about this. So he'll tell us about that. You come and have a listen. So okay, and of course the other thing that really fascinated me was because you nearly ended up like me. You nearly ended up with no qualifications at all. Because I left school at 15 and had my first job, straight when I was 15. I've been working since I was 15. So I don't have any education. But you were very nearly like that, weren't you? But you did this huge thing. I can't imagine how you did it. You studied for your A-levels on your own.
Mm.
How did you do that?
Just to contextualise this, so I left school a few months after my O-levels because I was a table tennis player.
We'll get into whiff-waff later.
Yeah, right.
Boris's whiff-waff.
We need to bring that in there because that was the reason why I left school, because I wanted to pursue it. Yeah. I went to Sweden and played with the top professional team in Stockholm.
Where were you living then?
In Reading.
In Reading? Right. Do they have a table tennis table?
Yeah, well...
for most of us, table tennis is at Christmas, isn't it? On the dining room table, when those things you screw on and you have a go with your dad. And the ball ends up in the goldfish bowl.
Yeah. Well, it's not, I don't think, irrelevant for what we'll talk about later, that Reading, a particular street in Reading, Silverdale Road, a very anonymous street, by the way. Is anyone from Reading?
Not anymore, it's not. Yeah.
Oh, you are? So you'll know that. Where are you from?
I was at university in Reading.
Okay, so Silverdale Road is very near White Knights.
Yeah.
So a pretty anonymous street, but it contained, for a period in the 1980s, about half of the top table tennis players in the country, and it was like a ping pong mecca.
Why was that?
Well, I mean, so I grew up under the view, with the conventional view that to become, brilliant, world class, you had to be born with the right set of predispositions or the right kind of genetic inheritance. You had to be born super talented if you were going to make it.
The Russians are still doing it.
Yeah, well, look, I don't think the talent is irrelevant. I think it's a real phenomenon. But what struck me about the Silverdale Road phenomenon is that there are a lot of subtle cultural and social factors that can drive success and enable people to fulfil their potential. So we had the best coach in the country who taught on the school adjacent to Silverdale Road. Coaching, I think, great teaching is very important. But we also had access, this is pre-lottery funding, so there were very few table tennis clubs in the whole of the country. If you wanted to play table tennis, you either played on the dining room table at Christmas or you went to the local sports centre and had to wait for the badminton to finish, or the yoga, or the five-a-side football. For weird reasons, you'll know at Green Road, which is right by the university, there was a purpose-built table tennis club, open 24 hours a day, and everybody...
Who paid for that?
It was just built. It was like a prefab, and there was a table in there, and the members had to pay some trivial amount of money each year. You would go in, you would turn on the light, put on the heater in the corner, but everyone on Silverdale Road had a set of keys. So practice before school, after school, holidays, weekends. And so you had some who were better than others, so maybe talent can explain some of the variation. But the extraordinary concentration of success there wasn't to do with the talent on the street, it was to do with this capacity based on great coaching and the opportunity to clock up practice that enabled us to fulfill
So
it. And that was the opening of my first
So it might have been
book,
a judo club, mightn't it? Or it might have been a martial arts club.
But you see this.
Yeah.
I mean, in sport, which is objectively measurable, who's better than other people, you can see it quite clearly in sport. Yeah. There are extraordinary geographical concentrations.
There's a little place where I live in Frimley in Surrey, and there's a judo club there, and they've had several champions coming out of their club. I'm the president of, used to be the president of Cambridge Gymnastics Club. Had several gymnastics champions. There's something about which comes first, isn't it? The talent or the facility?
Yeah. Sometimes there'll be good people there, and it drives the capacity to build the facility.
So you talk about Beckham, don't you? When he was a kid, he did 2,037 keepy uppies, and then thought he'd cracked it.
Yeah, so he couldn't really do keep me ups when he started doing them in his back garden in Leytonstone, but he had this extraordinary commitment, and he kept learning and practicing, and So I'm a great believer. I mean, if I was to give a memory test to this room, the digit span task, it's a famous memory test where I give a list of random digits one after the other, 6, 8, 9, 1, 2, 4, 0, 5, 9. The average recall in the room would be 5. The talented ones would get 6 or 7, the slightly less talented 3 or 4. I don't know where you...
6, 8, 9, 1, 2, 4, 0.
I would have to have written them down to check whether you're
6, 8, 9, 1, 2, 5, 7, 8, 3. Darling.
But interesting, so even though there's a sort of a bell-shaped distribution, if you went away and had good training for 100 hours, 150 hours, most people in this room would be able to recall about 80 random digits. And with another 150 hours, 300 random digits. Let me get that right, about 120 random digits.
You get the guy that can remember all the playing cards, can't he? Because he tells himself a little story, doesn't he?
Yes, so that's one of the tricks that experts use in order to circumnavigate through the complexity of remembering playing cards or digits, or, as it were, encoding how an opponent is moving so you know where the ball is going before they've hit it in a table tennis game. I've been very struck by the extraordinary capacity that ordinary people have to improve their skill over time with the right kind of practice and the right kind of training. That fits in quite strongly to some of the points I make in Black Box Thinking about medical training, where I think there are quite clear ways that one can build diagnostic and other types of skill that are sometimes not being utilised.
Let's get on to the book because it's a fascinating book. But let's go back. So, you were doing Boris's Whiff Waff.
Yeah.
Have you spoken to Boris about Whiff Waff?
Yes, I have actually. Yeah.
Okay, so Boris's Whiff Waff.
I was in the Balliol first cricket team with his. So I taught myself my A levels.
No, but this is important. So you taught yourself your A levels, and it wasn't enough just to get into university. You got into Balliol.
Well, this was my dad, who So he was horrified when I left school to play table tennis, but for really weird reasons, I started getting interested in economics. The inflation rate was high, and I was like, I don't understand why this is a problem, because all you need to do is instruct the shops to put the prices on the goods that were the same as the week before, and you've eliminated inflation. So I phoned my dad and I told him, he said, look, there's an issue with this, which is that if you start manipulating prices, you create black markets.
Isn't that what Stalin did, actually?
Right, exactly. And
Moscow.
They pegged the ruble and it just created a huge black market. He said, look, black markets will all queuing. And I said, that sounds quite interesting. He said, well, if you want to know more about that, let me send you a textbook on economics. And I read it, because you know what I mean? It came from within. I was interested in it, rather than being told I had to do it. The motivation was internal to the task, rather than externally imposed. And it completely, it's like a light had gone on. I read the book, probably took me 3 weeks, and I was a very underperforming student at school. But I took this A-level, I read the book, and he said, well, why don't you take an A-level? I had to go up to King's Cross in a building, send in a photo to prove that I was who I said I was. It was signed by the vicar of the local church, this is Matthew Syed. And when I got a grade 8, Dad said, why don't you apply to Oxford? I said, don't be so unrealistic. But a very progressive tutor there said, yeah, we think this guy's a bit, maybe he's got some potential. So that was a big change in my life.
How was Oxford?
Well, so I continued to play table tennis whilst I was there. So I was playing for Montpellier in the French League, for England on the international circuit. I played the Olympic Games in my first year. So they were quite generous. I would go in for tutoring.
Which Olympics did you go to?
Barcelona.
Barcelona, yeah. How was it being Olympian?
Oh, fab. Loved it. I was still massively entertained. But the great thing was that, you'd play a match and you'd go to Oxford for the day to do your tutorial. And you could switch off from the fact that you'd just lost to some annoying, Frenchman, Juice in the Third, and you could read a bit of Plato or a bit of economic theory. That was a wonder. I love the synergy that I think the ancient Greeks understood very well between a healthy body and a healthy mind. They didn't see the gymnasiums and the academies as like separate institutions. They saw them as part of a holistic conception of mankind. We've lost that a lot in professional sport now, and it's terribly sad. Premier League footballers, they're told, oh, school, don't bother with it. In actual fact, they would be better decision makers, better leaders on the pitch if they were developed as human beings and they developed their minds. This is one of the big problems with the England team. They're just thought of as coach will tell you what to do, you kick the ball, and then when something goes wrong, like against Iceland, they don't know how to adapt and to react.
Well, you were with the English football team today,
Rugby.
rugby team. Right? Yeah. What did you tell them?
I was talking
Go
about
out
the
and
importance
score.
of my... No,
Go out and score tries. Go and win.
No, win the game. No, really about the stuff that I'm most interested in now, which is high performance and the sort of culture that creates the dynamics of high performance. How we can have I mean, culture sounds a bit soft and fluffy, but you get the culture right. It's a very rigorous science underpinning the psychological dynamics that create success, and I talked a bit about that.
It's interesting. So what? So you went. You came down from university. You got a very good degree. What happened then?
So I carried on playing table tennis till 2003, and I enjoyed my table tennis very much. Very passionate about it.
Just that we've come 13 years. It's a long way in 13.
Yeah, so to 92 Olympics in my first year, so I graduated in 95.
Right.
Then I played a few years of table tennis. I started a business while I was still playing, but very part-time. It was after retirement, really, that I started getting into writing for the Times, writing books.
It's still, I mean, I guess there would be some people that regard table tennis as a pastime rather than a sport.
Oh, yeah, I get that a lot.
Yeah.
Particularly in America. I mean, here too. You go to America, they say, "Can you beat Forrest Gump?" You know. But table tennis globally, I mean, it's very big in Asia.
Yes, it is, and it's. I mean, it fits very neatly into a stadium, doesn't it? Everyone can see it. You don't need a huge pitch to do it. You could light it up like a snooker table. Very easy to get sponsors for it. I would think it's made for television, isn't it?
I think I can see it objectively now. I've been out of the game for long enough. I think tennis is better on television. I think the spin in table tennis, very subtle.
Well, they do all this funny stuff, don't they? And then suddenly the ball appears and explodes on the other side of the thing.
I think that's quite impenetrable for a lot of viewers. And I think
with slow-mo, I mean, look what Sky have done with football, with slow-mo, and I think it's made absolute gift. I think we might sponsor
we need an entrepreneur like you to join
something
the sport.
Else John and I can lose money at. We'd be very good at that.
You have no idea how true that
is. We're excellent at finding things to lose money at. Anyway, so you're still playing ping pong.
Yep.
Yeah, and then because the kit's changed a lot as well, isn't it?
Table tennis changed.
Bits of plywood. Now it's all sponge and different sides of the bats and. Yeah. Costs a fortune.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. The equipment's changed a lot, but I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed playing, training.
You still play?
No, I don't play.
Not even on the dining room table.
Not even. Sometimes on the kitchen island.
Excuse me, darling, on the kitchen island.
We've got one with the hobs on it.
Oh, how posh! and is that when you're waiting for the Ocado delivery?
Yes. God, he's getting me now.
So, right, you were still playing whiff whap. I do love this whiff whap. I'm sorry, I can't leave that alone. John said don't mention whiff whap, but I couldn't not. And so then, okay, what happened then? You ran a business. What were you doing?
So actually, funnily enough, given what you just said, we ran a table tennis event company. So we staged events, got sponsors, international television.
Did you lose money doing it?
We at the time I stopped doing it,
I could buy the losses and run it properly.
We had just sort of moved into profit, but very narrowly. At that. So we did them at the Albert Hall. You mentioned snooker. We did a big event on the BBC at the Crucible.
Oh, right.
Theatre, Fairfield Concert Hall in
the Crucible would be ideal for
it was good. I mean, it was good.
Perhaps we'll have another go at that. Okay.
Well, if you want to join in, I can tell you there's a lot of an appetite in table tennis.
I quite fancy that. Okay, right. What happened then?
Then I started writing for the Times.
Yeah. Well, you don't just start writing for the Times, do you?
Yeah, so I think
well, you did.
Well, I did actually. So you remember 192 Director Inquiries. I phoned Director Inquiries and I said, could you put me through to the Times? And actually I didn't say that. I said, can you give me the telephone number of the Times, which they did. I phoned the
small lads.
Yeah, the number. Asked to be put through to the sports editor. I also called the Guardian. I maybe shouldn't admit that. No, I've been working at the Times for as long as I have.
You could have had a proper career at the Guardian.
And the sports editor at the time said, you know what, write a diary piece once a month, and we'll see how it goes.
Was this a sporting diary piece?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were dreadful. Yeah, I mean, this is another thing about the power of practice. Obviously, those early columns were really horribly constructed. I mean, you might say that about the later pieces as well, but...
Listen, I write one every day. There is nothing you can tell me about badly constructed. Badly constructed. 700 words just taken at random, thrown in a sack. I know exactly. You only write once a week then, don't you?
I write 3 columns a week.
It's easy, isn't it?
Yeah, that's...
How many words do you write a week?
So the columns are 1,300.
Yeah.
And then features and interviews.
That's not a proper job, is it?
Well, you could easily say that. I was tempted to agree. There is time to do other things, that's for sure.
Yeah, good. And I was interested to see that you wrote somewhere that you always go out for a walk, or you like to go for a walk before you write. Clears your mind.
Did I say that?
Yeah, you did.
Oh, I do sometimes on the Sunday for Monday column.
Yeah, because I just contrast with me, because I get out of bed, put my dressing gown on, and sit there till lunchtime until I'm finished.
So you write a blog every day?
Yeah, in my pyjamas, mostly.
I've got differently now.
I've got leather patches on my dressing gown. So where do you go for inspiration? How does it? Where's
I'm writing a column.
Yeah, are you told what the topics are, or do you go through?
Not really. So football on Monday, and then sort of a notebook at the front of the paper. What do I do for inspiration? I don't really know. I think there's so much material out there to potentially write about. I mean, particularly, sport's a very broad canvas in many ways, because you can write about the morality of a particular bad tackle, or about privacy. This week I wrote about. I don't know if I'm writing about this week. I mean, tomorrow I'm writing about the death of a Brazilian football captain called Carlos Alberto, who scored. Does anyone remember that goal that went through the entire team and was knocked into the corner? So you can write about teamwork and team dynamics, about beauty. It's so psychology.
Yeah, sport is a kind of tapestry of life, isn't it?
It's marvellous.
We can all connect to it in some ways. I mean, people say to me, how do you write every day? Well, there's just always something going on in the NHS.
Yeah.
It's either a disaster, or there's something good to write, or I just fall back on management technique, really. So there's always something to write about. I never really have too much trouble doing that. So you've been, how long have you been writing for the Times now?
Sort of full on, probably. 10, 12 years. I mean, we're publishing a book of collected columns. I think the editor, who had the terrible job of having to go through everything, I think it's more than 2 million words now.
Have you published the collected...
It's coming up.
Yeah. Be interesting to see when you look back and think, why did I write that?
Yeah, it has been. I had to look through the selections the editor made while I was on holiday last week, and it was interesting to go through it and see how my thoughts have evolved and how sport's changed. I mean, money's a big issue in sport. You also write about the sport itself.
You've been. We'll get on to the black box in a minute, but I mean that's an essential element in black boxes is Brailsford and cycling.
Mm-hmm.
What do you make of the latest about the pain-killing injections? And why have so many sportsmen got asthma? Why do they all need something to make them breathe easier?
So they call it therapeutic use exemptions.
Yes.
You're not allowed.
There is actually an Italian doctor who's done a paper on asthma in top performing athletes, and apparently there is a greater propensity because of the extent to which they use their lungs. I don't know, it sounds like a lot of bullshit to me.
You see, being paid by the sports teams.
Okay, well let's ask you the question. When you were playing ping pong, did you have asthma?
No, I did. My brother suffered badly with asthma. And he was a very good table tennis player, but he genuinely had. I mean, I on TUEs, I think that they are very often abused.
They need to be tightened up.
You're allowed to take certain substances legally, others are banned. But on the banned list, some of them are usable if you get a medical exemption, if there is a medical
Who's
reason.
that tennis player, the girl that's been taking
Sharapova.
Yeah, she's been taking it for years. I mean, that's like a chronic illness that she's been taking this therapeutic exemption for. I mean, it gets to a point. I mean, I see a therapeutic exemption as someone being acutely unwell to get them over a period, and then off they go. But to have an injection, we've got to be very careful what we say. I do understand that, but to have an injection of a particular drug that the need coincides before major cycling races in a sport that's bent over backwards to be clean, it just invites people to ask the questions again, doesn't it? It sort of sets the reputation back.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think from the perspective of the team leader, I suspect something like this happened. There's a cyclist who wanted to have actually, I'm trying to think, do I have any idea how it worked? Well, I mean, what I do know is that the doctor within the Team Sky setup verified that a drug was needed for medical reasons.
Tramadol?
I think it was a corticosteroid. Was it called tramadol? Maybe it would have been. Sorry?
Triamcinolone.
Yeah.
And what wasn't tramadol used as well as a painkiller?
As an opiate and analgesic.
Yeah, there's a painkiller. Sort of thing old ladies have, isn't it?
People with sore wrists.
Old people with sore wrists. Yeah. It doesn't work for me.
But then they have to get an independent specialist to agree that it has a medical imperative, and then they tell the governing body itself, and that has to be signed off by the governing body, so the independent governing body. Am I comfortable with it? Absolutely not. But it's a very different thing to Lance Armstrong taking steroids and not telling anyone about it. I mean, if he had volunteered, by the way, I'm taking these steroids and EPO to the governing body, it would have been banned. Yeah. They actually told the governing body, who said yes, there's a medical reason. So did they push it? Yeah, I think you can make the claim. It would be interesting to see how all of this plays out. But it's worth saying that it's a very different type of unethical behaviour, if it is unethical compared with some others.
I absolutely get that, and we need to be very careful how we couch this. But it just seems to me that it gets really into your book, doesn't it? And the very interesting segment. There's a big piece in there about Brailsford and the minor gains and the many a mickle makes a muckle theory of management, and it's about pushing the boundaries. Now, Brailsford pushes the boundaries to the point where he makes all of his staff and athletes use a hand cleanser, so they don't, if they pick up a germ, they don't transfer it to each other. That's pushing the boundaries to the absolute limit of peak performance. And then on the other hand, you get this sort of medical aspect of people having drugs that it's okay to have because someone said it's okay to have, that pushes the boundaries in another way.
I don't think there's a strong analogy there between Team Sky and medicine, except perhaps pharmaceutical companies rigging trials in order to get a drug into circulation that might not otherwise have got into circulation. What one is trying to do with marginal gains is find the improvements that can get you to where you want to go. And in healthcare, you want to have the best care, the best professionals, the best techniques, the best procedures, the best institutions. And if one can improve those, then one should emphatically take them. It's not unethical to improve outcomes in healthcare in the way that it can be sometimes in sport, which is a zero-sum game, because if they do it, find an advantage that the other teams lack unfairly, then that's not particularly good. But healthcare is positive sum. If one hospital starts doing things better, it's worth sharing that with other hospitals so that cascades around the organisation. That's a concept that I discussed in the book called the adoption rate, which I think is quite low in healthcare in all sorts of different ways.
Which is what we do with the Academy of Fabulous Staff. It's
right.
Based on the theory of positive deviance, where ordinary people are doing fantastic stuff in the same circumstances as everyone else. It's the theory that sits behind the Academy and sharing best practice. But coming back to the marginal gain theory, I've written, I don't know if any of you read my stuff this morning, but just to be a contrariist, I said that that the NHS doesn't need Brailsford really anymore. It needs something much bigger than Brailsford to move the whole thing on, rather than, we are where we are. Should we be focusing on the tiny marginal gains, or should we really be saying, we need system redesign?
They're not mutually exclusive, and I think it's a mistake to think that it's an either-or thing. The great institutions are looking both for the big disruptive changes, for the paradigm shifts, for the system changes that can have a big impact, but they're also capable of looking at the small improvements that can themselves accumulate. If you think about Google, for example, which is a successful organisation, they've been pioneering at least one massive disruptive change to the world, which is their PageRank algorithm. And you will know that they're also trying to make sure they can incubate new big disruptive changes by giving their staff a certain amount of time off to come up with big ideas, big dramatic changes that will disrupt the world. But at the same time, they're capable of looking at their small assumptions and improving on every single one of those too. And one example of that is for example, the colour of the web links. They're blue. Is it the best shade of blue? I describe in the book how they divided the colour blue into 40 different shades, randomly allocated users who clicked onto their website onto each of the different shades, measured the resulting profitability of the relationships, established that one of the shades was better than all the others, changed all of their web links to that shade for an annual uplift in revenue of $200 million. They're doing both. Dyson iterating the vacuum cleaner whilst creating an amazing new hairdryer. I find this in almost all of the organisations. Toyota, fantastic at finding marginal gains through their production system. That's often about reducing unwanted variation in the production process using very rigorous statistical techniques, but they're also looking for big disruptive changes. And all of this, to sort of rewind a little bit.
Virginia Mason, right? It's a good example.
It's another great example. So, Virginia, I know that some people in healthcare don't think Virginia Mason is necessarily a good analogy for some reasons.
I think the reason is they got Virginia Mason was really rather foisted on them. We were told from on high that Virginia Mason are going to come and show you how to run a hospital, which is not the way to do it, right, in my view. And of course, Virginia Mason have just come spectacularly unstuck with their regulator, because nobody can do everything right all the time the first time.
Right, but Virginia Mason, I think, has been very good at finding small gains.
Yes, they are good, and I should say they follow us on Twitter, so we should be very nice.
That's good stuff. But the really crucial point is that the curiosity to rationally establish ways that we can improve our performance at the micro or the macro level, that's a psychological question more than anything else.
Well, isn't it, Matthew? It's also a question for the psychology of the organisation, where you talk in the book about the risks involved in innovation and change. The extent to which the NHS is able to innovate, and if something doesn't work, it doesn't matter. If Dyson was a surgeon and had registered 5,127 patents, I think it is 5,127 patents that he's registered. If that was somebody doing hip operations, we'd be in deep trouble.
But there's an important distinction here. There's an important distinction between so with Dyson, in order to get a fully functioning dual cyclone vacuum cleaner, he absolutely had to create a whole series of failed prototypes, 5,126. Every single one was a stepping stone to understand better the engineering problem, separation efficiency, airflow dynamics, and all of the other things that they're interested in at their plant down in Malmesbury. And that's how innovation often happens. This is true in all technologies, that you put your ideas to the world, you see where they're suboptimal, and you make the relevant adaptations. Terribly important. That's how innovation happens. You've got to be prepared. If you have 10 different ingredients, 3 of which might combine to create a good drug, but you don't know which 3, you need to start testing different combinations of the 3. You have to have a tolerance for the failures that are the stepping stones to innovation, for sure. But this is coming back to the point you made. That is a different issue to errors of execution. You don't want a pilot pulling, I wonder if I pull this switch, whether the plane, and then the plane crashes. Do you? You don't want a pilot to start taking risks when the plane is in midair. In those circumstances, you want to you want to take the risks in a simulator. Or if you're a company, you want to test your assumptions in a pilot scheme so you can test small and then learn big. Or to go back to manufacturing, if there are errors in the this is a better way to think about it maybe, is that, if you're trying to deliver a car consistently, then all of the components in the car have to be of the right size and shape. Otherwise the car won't be able to move. And so if there is deviation in the size of one of the components, the car's screwed. You need to know where those errors of execution are so you can bear down upon them. You need openness in these errors. These are the kind of errors I talk about a lot in black box thinking in medicine. A nurse knows the right drug to give a patient but inadvertently gives the wrong one. You need to know why that happened at a systems level in order to reform the system to make that kind of mistake less likely in the future.
Let me just interject there, because you spend some time in the book, in the narrative, discussing the right organisational environment that allows people to confess they've made mistakes. Like, for example, in Virginia Mason, where they have encouraged people who have made mistakes to come forward and say, do you know what, I kind of got this wrong, and what have we learned from that? But the difficulty there is, of course, if you're a doctor and you say, I have made a mistake, suddenly you've got the GMC on your neck, you've got lawyers chasing you, you're suspended, even if you're innocent, your career is trashed because people see you've been suspended. And it's the whole attitudinal thing within the organisation that for me is wrong.
Yeah, I think there are two separable but related barriers to learning from errors of execution. One is litigation, blame, negative consequences for one's career if one admits to honest mistakes that are often created by systemic problems, by the way. Point one. There is another, though. I'd like to talk about that in more depth, but I think that's a massive issue in healthcare and the one that I hear the most about since writing Black Box Thinking. There is another one that is worth acknowledging, however, which is, how can I put it, ego. Senior doctors who have had long and expensive educations and have letters after their name and high reputations, and there's something quite deep in healthcare culture that when you're at the top of the hierarchy, you don't really make mistakes. You're clinically infallible. If you've ever read anything by James Reason or Nancy Berlinger, you'll see these kinds of... And I think that is true. And I think there is a tendency, therefore, instead of saying, right, something went wrong, what can we learn about it? There's a tendency towards self-justification. That was just a complication, or it's just one of those things. Or that was the patient's unusual symptoms. This has been very well studied in observational literature, and I don't know if I've got it with me here, but the kind of things that are often said to take the sting out of the mistake, but which also prevent meaningful adaptation. This isn't just a problem in healthcare. It happens in, a better example perhaps to really make it clear is in economics, where the high reputation economic forecasters objectively make the worst predictions. And that sounds paradoxical. Why are the high reputation economists making the worst predictions? And the reason is the high reputation economists, as measured by how often they visit TV studios, they find when there is an error of prediction, that is an opportunity to revise or enrich one's theoretical assumptions, because the model is not the system. And yet, instead of doing so, they come up with these quite tortuous ex-post rationalizations for why they were right all along.
You talk about this in the book. You talk about the banking crisis, don't you?
Right.
Where you say it was... Well, actually, when I was reading the book, I wasn't sure I agreed with you. You said, in part, the banking crisis was caused by people who took on more debt than they should, and they should have known better. Your implication was they should have known better. Actually, I think they were just oversold by a bunch of crooks.
Was that in my book?
Yeah.
So I do talk about...
It's around the 3,000th page.
Okay. I think the banking
306.
crisis was a complex interaction of lots of different things happening at the same time. But I think it's worth throwing out there. I think that is a clear problem. The tendency towards creative self-justification rather than learning at the senior level of clinicians. And I'm happy to try and defend that in question.
Well,
but
don't. I mean, I think all of us in this room would probably recognise what you're talking about. But but the question then is, well, really, what do we do about it?
You need to change the mindset. So there's a clear
and
science on
you
it.
change the mindset, really. Do you think, I mean, the implication is, in your book, I think, is that you can change mindset. My view is that some of these minds are so set that really we're looking at a generational thing. The next generation of doctors have got to be brought up in a different environment.
Yeah, I would like to see the education of doctors changing, so that there's a sense that, high performance isn't about saying how much do we know. It's about finding out what we don't know. That's what high performance means. Because in a complex world, there's an infinity that we don't know. How quickly can we push back the barriers? How quickly can we improve our systems? How can we improve our procedures? How can we drive diagnostic intuitions higher by leveraging type 1 and type 2 errors to improve performance over time? How can we get the big disruptive changes? Instead of saying, you know what, you're a senior doctor, therefore you are clinically infallible. If you read any of the books, I'd love to you to go away and look at this.
To give us
how the basic cultural assumptions are established. You mentioned Brailsford. When he said we can break the problem of winning a bike race into all of its component parts and try and improve every single one, started with the bike design. You can imagine what the existing coaches might have said at that point. Are you seriously saying we don't know what we're doing, that we can improve the bike design, that we've been doing it wrong all these years? When you say to people we can improve, you're implicitly saying you're not already perfect. People actively avoid engaging with the data that can improve performance if it will show that they're less than perfect. I found this with a medical group. I'm not going to say who they are, just in case they would be upset if I said so publicly. And I said, look, measure the complications of this particular procedure. See if there's a pattern in the complications. Then start bearing down upon them by some rational reforms, and then go through that process again. When we put it to a vote, more than 50% of the clinicians didn't want the data on the complication rate because they were worried it would show they were less than perfect. It's like playing golf. And you learn to play golf by hitting the ball, seeing where the errors are, and slowly improving your technique to get the ball down the middle. You can't improve golf if you play in the dark. You've got to know where you're going wrong in order to put it right. See what I mean? You practice. If you don't know where the ball's gone, how do you know how to readjust your technique? Practice is meaningless and futile. What we were saying to those doctors is put the lights on. They were resistant to that. I'm finding again and again in conversations at high levels with Royal Medical Colleges, there is a reluctance to access meaningful information that can improve performance because the professionals are worried that it might show the lesson. That is catastrophic cultural terms. But that's an independent issue from the problem of blame, which is where people are worried about the external ramifications, not their internal fear about what it says about their self-image, but the external ramifications of speaking up about problems, that it's going to come back and they're going to be litigated or struck off. That, I mean, I'd be happy to talk about that, because I think what I've learned more and more is that is another massive barrier to
it is a massive impediment, and I think we're seeing the GMC now talking about a lighter touch. The Secretary of State, Jeremy Hunt, was talking about changes in maternity procedures so that people don't feel so threatened and they're able to have a no-blame culture. And of course in New Zealand the whole approach is very different there, where they figure out on fixing the outcome first, and then they figure out how did it happen, and then they figure out how to fix it. It's a whole different process. I'd like to move you on, if I may, because I've got an eye on the time. You talk a lot about the airlines, which I think is really interesting. And I've always said, look, there is no parallel with the airlines and the NHS, because the airline pilot wants to get home at least as much as you do, and so he's going to be cautious for himself as well as the other 400 passengers. The surgeon, if he makes a mistake, he still goes home. The whole emotional drivers are quite different.
Okay, so with respect, I'm going to disagree.
No, I know. It's because I've read in the book that you were, so I want you to.
Yeah, so that, I think, misconceives the problem for two separate reasons. One is that the implied solution is that in order to reduce errors in operating theatres, you need to hold a gun to the head of the surgeon, and as soon as you make a mistake, you're going to be shot. That isn't the reason that mistakes are happening. The reasons that mistakes are happening are often systemic in nature, not a lack of motivation. If you look at the death of Elaine Bromley, the problem was that the surgeon and the anaesthetist are desperately trying to access the airway. They want that woman to live. They're committed, diligent people,
to the nurse.
but they're not listening to the nurse. That's a systems problem. They've lost track of time. That's a systems problem. You increase the incentive to save the patient by saying if you don't, you die, is not getting to the problem at all. And what one needs, in my opinion, isn't a change in the incentive structure. It's a change in the culture. It's a very different way of thinking about it. And until the culture begins to change, and I can talk, if you would like me to, about what that means and what that looks like, the performances, if one tries to change it through an incentive structure, it won't happen. And just coming back to blame, a good way to think about this is an early incident in the history of aviation. B-17 bombers were crashing inexplicably. They commissioned a psychologist to do an investigation, and it turned out that the switch link to the wheels, or the landing gear, and the switch link to the landing flaps were identical and side by side on the dashboard. So under the pressure of difficult landing, all sorts of things going on. They were inadvertently, lots of pilots, inadvertently pulling the wrong switch. The planes were belly flopping onto the runway. Now, having figured out what was going wrong at a systems level, this is an ergonomic problem. There's an obvious and enlightened systemic change that can be introduced at that point. And it turned out to be a small wheel shape, a little tab attached to one of the switches, and a small flap shape attached to the other. So they're now intuitive in terms of their meaning, easily identified under pressure. Accidents of that kind disappeared overnight. Think how easy it would have been to say to the pilots who survived the crashes in advance of that kind of an investigation, you are idiots. How can you be pulling the wrong bloody switch? You've been trained for 10 years. There's probably a sign in the cockpit saying don't press the wrong switch, but you're still doing it. Sack these idiots, and then we're okay. Get rid of the bad apples. It might look expedient from a corporate point of view to separate the organisation from the professionals who are making the mistakes. Two things have happened, however. One, you get rid of the pilots, but the systemic problem is still there. It's there, in place, ready to kill future pilots and future passengers. Point one. Point two, you've just sent a signal to everyone in the organisation to cover their backs, to cover up the info. Now, in healthcare, most of the important information is held by people on the ground who are familiar with the context-specific, high-pressure reality that they're confronting day by day. Managers or regulators or courts who blame preemptively destroy the flow of information that is a prerequisite for meaningful adaptation. So the question becomes, how do you combat these? Because there are very specific biases that you may know about. The hindsight bias. When an error's happened after the event, it's very easy to pin it on the professional without taking the trouble to... So one of the things that I think aviation can teach, and I'm not saying it can teach huge amounts, but one of the things is the investigators are really good at surfacing the underlying causal mechanisms and leading diligent, brilliant professionals to make errors of execution. They combat the hindsight bias. They know about the fundamental attribution error. About 97% of aviation investigations find systems problems that both allow you to reform the system, but encourage people to speak up, knowing that they're not going to be blamed unfairly. In healthcare, that virtually reverses.
We're just starting to have a new group, which is the NHS Safety Advisory Group, which are really going to try and be like the aircraft inspector. But I don't think they're going to do very much until we can sort out this question of if you make a mistake, you can say goodbye to your career. We need desperately to resolve that. We interviewed, we had an evening with Neil Dixon, who's the boss of I think you know Neil is the boss of the General Medical Council, and I think he was good enough to admit really that quite a lot of it had gone too far and we were being over-regulated. We see it with inspections. Everyone knows that CQC is my bête noire. We go back as far as Deming, and Deming will tell you inspection doesn't improve quality, but it's a completely wrong thing to do. And then we wonder now why 20% of chief executive jobs are either done by interim or vacant, because no one will take the jobs on. We've driven out good people because they're described as being bad leaders. Why they're bad leaders? Because they don't have enough staff. They don't have enough staff because in 2010 somebody cut off the training places for nurses. You know, and that causal thing. And I was thinking about the causal thing when I read in your book. Tell us that nice story about the plane that nearly landed on the roof of the. Was it the Penta Hotel in Heathrow? I mean, it's a long story. If you could just kind of abbreviate it, but what was so interesting for me was not so much the story of the near miss, which Matthew will tell you, but it was the reaction of the guy afterwards. What happened to that pilot when you spoke to him afterwards?
Yes, yeah. Well, I didn't speak to the pilot because this was an aviation near miss event.
Yeah.
Where unusually for aviation they targeted the pilot and put him on trial.
And the magistrate only fined him £2,000. And you say in the book it's probably because the magistrate wasn't really convinced that there was a case to answer.
But he was devastated by it, and this is a very common finding now in the literature. The second victim, people are emotionally traumatised by the thought that they have been involved in an adverse event, and if it isn't treated in a mature way, I think the concept. So the pilot, tragically killed himself. The concept of just culture is really, I think, very, very important.
Now, it is important to tell the story. The plane was landing in very bad weather. There was a decision to divert or not. They decided that they would just carry on. And for a variety of things that were completely outside their control, they ended up lining up not on the runway, but on the A4 alongside the runway at Heathrow, and confused a lot of lights, and nearly landed on the roof. Within 5 feet of the roof of the hotel. And the pilot, when they did land safely, got a round of applause, and everyone said he was a hero. And then he got prosecuted, which, as you say, was unusual.
Yeah, and there were very deep-lying systems.
And he took his car to, was it BG Head or somewhere, and gassed himself.
Yeah.
It's a tragic story, I thought. But there's a lot in that, isn't there, about blame and guilt and how we feel about making mistakes. To try and get people to understand that actually the great sin is not making a mistake. The great sin is covering up, hiding it, and not learning from it. Because if you make that mistake, the chances are someone else could.
Yeah, that's right. And it's a big barrier. Yeah, that's a terribly sad case, actually. That near miss event. But for me, often people will say, should it be a no blame culture? I think that's a mistake. If a pilot gets drunk, then other pilots want that pilot to be penalised. That's gross negligence. If people act malevolently, there needs to be...
But that's not a mistake, is it? That's
stupid behaviour. Or it's an adverse event. So I think there are adverse events that require professionals to be blamed. But if you just rewind in healthcare, so two quick things. Think about the central line infection rate that killed 45,000 people a year in America until quite recently. So two things worth reflecting. Firstly, senior doctors for decades said, healthcare's complex, sometimes people die, it's a complication of the procedure. People can die in plain sight almost indefinitely when people are in the wrong mindset. It was only when a proper investigation was undertaken to figure out why that was happening that they realised that one of the steps that was often being missed is not sterilising the catheter site. That finding to a 5-point medical checklist that you'll know about, which cut the central line infection from 45,000 to 0. Same data change in the UK. Now, so the investigation was central in figuring out but think about how often there was a problem, I don't know how long ago, but it certainly was a problem that I read about where the clinicians not washing or sterilising their hands when interacting with patients. Now this was a problem. That would have been it, but it was a systems problem. When the clinicians were interviewed, they were told, they said, well, you have to walk a very long way to get to the hand sanitizer. And I've got a patient here who needs me now. Professionals are often dealing with competing demands when they're making the decisions in real time to get the job done. So I think I'm right in saying that all hospitals now have the hand sanitizer outside the ward or outside the room, so it's easy to do the right thing.
It dangles on the end of the bed now.
Right, so that was and additional training to talk about the importance of this. And however, if there were, as I understand it, in the United States anyway, there's still a tiny proportion, despite it being easy to do the right thing, and despite training that it's an important thing to do. There's some who don't bother. I think it's okay in those circumstances.
It's interesting because I don't think a lot of people. I mean, I went through this infection control thing quite closely. A friend of ours, Dr. Sharon Lamont, who we used to call her the NHS's chief cleaning lady, because she was responsible for cleaning up the NHS and making us all wash our hands. And I remember saying to her, I can't believe that we've got to tell people to wash their hands. And she said, you better believe it, because they don't do it, because there was no culture of washing hands. I mean, particularly with senior medics, who would do a ward round in a three-piece suit and a set of cufflinks, and the senior medic bare below the elbows, you never saw it. And it took a huge effort to make people change their practice, which brings me on to, you talk a lot about culture. You see, I don't believe you can change culture. I think you can change the climate, and the climate contributes over time to changing the culture. But changing culture is too big an ask to do, I think.
I don't agree.
Good.
You can change culture.
Yeah. Over time.
How?
Yeah. Well,
how?
Well, so
how long you got?
It depends on the context. So, how specific do you want me? What I would like to see in cultural change is a culture of continuous improvement, openness, and collaboration. The continuous improvement piece requires people to recognise that they can improve, that they're not already perfect, the senior clinicians, that they can get better, that those who are junior can improve in what they're doing. The way to get that going, these are very good randomised controlled trials, that when you talk to people about how success happens, that it's a journey of engagement. Beckham doing his free kicks, Mozart practicing the piano, great. Designers like Dyson iterating through 5,126 failed prototypes. People begin to see success as a journey. They're interested in the day-by-day experiences that they can evaluate and reflect upon to improve what they're doing. They want to get mentoring to improve what they're doing. They want to read what the internet is saying about how improvement happens. You create those dynamics by changing the model or heuristic that people are effectively using to interpret day by day their experiences. I haven't explained that very well. Think about, explain it a bit better. Think about a child watching. Is this a good example? How old are you? David Beckham taking a free kick. A child
poetry in motion,
isn't it? It is. It's poetic. It's flawless. It curls into the corner. It would be easy for the child to say, "Oh wow, David Beckham has something that I don't have because he can do that and I can't." When we witness high performance, we only see the performance. We have a limited data set. What don't we see?
We don't see his dad standing there moving slowly to the left to make him bend it even more to go in the net.
The years of practice
in the park.
Years of practice that went into its construction. Imagine if I was to bring somebody in here, read out 120 random digits, and they were to repeat them back to me in order. You would say that person's a genius. I could never do that because I struggle to remember my friend's phone number. But you could do it with 300 hours of proper practice. In other words, we have the wrong model, often, many of us, of how success happens. So we're threatened by our mistakes, we're threatened by our weaknesses. We assume that they are abiding deficiencies in ourselves, particularly if we're blamed for them by management who haven't looked at this. You change that model, the heuristic through which we're interpreting what we experience, the behaviour begins to change. The language is very important too. I could talk you through a lot on the way that language shapes the psychological assumptions that people are deploying day by day. Very, very important. The way that the way that performance reviews are conducted. There's a whole range of things that can change culture. I
think that changes climate, which contributes to the culture. But anyway, so you've done the black box, you've done Bounce, and you're working on a book. What are you working on now?
Well, so I have to admit, I have less time to work on it than I would like, but...
You can write a book in a fortnight.
Oh, well, I'll tell you what, I'd love your
No, I've
help.
done it lots of times.
I've become quite interested in team dynamics, teamwork and team dynamics.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be the next one. Collaboration, how people align, how you get... I mean, I've been very struck. I mean, it sort of goes back to an extent. I think one of the themes is the problem of very steep hierarchy gradients. We mentioned the problem in certain operating theatres where nurses find it difficult to speak up with the senior surgeon because they're supposed to be omnipotent, which of course they're not. They're human. And we used to see it a lot in cockpits where the engineer or the first officer wouldn't be able to challenge the pilot and the planes would crash. And you see it in the military where the generals are supposed to have all-seeing and all-knowing information on what's happening, and it's very difficult to challenge their strategic assumptions. That cost us very dearly. I mean, agree or disagree with the invasion of Iraq, but it's an extraordinary thing that the most expensively put together and sophisticated military operation in the history of the world, namely the United States, was completely outflanked by a very small, ramshackle group of low military sophistication in Iraq for a number of years. And the reason was very simple. It was a very steep hierarchy, so that the people on the ground who were seeing how Al-Qaeda's tactics were changing and mutating day by day, rapidly changing world, changing their explosive devices, the communication devices they used, the kind of clothing they would wear, the guys back at base, the generals didn't know any of that. But unless you could tell them, and also, if you wanted to deploy, you had to go up and down the chain of command. Al-Qaeda had moved on by that time.
Yeah.
It was only when they changed. It was only when they changed what I would call the culture, where there was more open reporting and more collaborative and a much flatter hierarchy. There's too many grades in the police.
Tom Peters does a lot, doesn't he, about taking out middle management culture, bring the boardroom closer to the ward. I've been beating my brains out talking about that for ages. And I know you're a big fan of Dyson. I went down to his factory and interviewed him a few years ago. And the thing that struck me there was every new starter in the factory spends a week on the factory floor and they make their own vacuum cleaner and they take it home. And that's what they do in the first week. They go through the whole process and make one of these things so they know why it works, how it works, why it's good. And I think you're right. I thought he was a very good guy. I then interviewed him on the NHS's 50th anniversary at Earl's Court. We did a big show there, and I took a Hoover and smashed it on the stage and said, "You want to go and buy one of these instead?" And he walked on. He was a good guy, good sport. Well, look, I know you've got to get off and write your column for the Times. I don't want it. Hey, how do you feel about writing behind a paywall? I would never do that.
So yeah, it's a shame, but you've got to make. I mean, in the long term,
You write for the Guardian.
it's got to be profitable, hasn't it? It's losing a lot of money.
Yeah.
So either you have a subsidy or you've got to make the business work.
Yeah.
If you can't persuade people to pay for the content, you can't expect people to pay for
Can
the
you listen to
journalists.
this, please? This is really important, Roy.
Great content. He wants me to charge for my editor. I'm not going to do it. Great content always comes first. We've got a few minutes. You do a couple of questions. If anybody's got any comments or questions they'd like to make, are you all enthralled by?
Just a comment about the egos that you mentioned.
Yeah. Now I should say that this gentleman is a very senior clinician, so be careful how we answer it.
No, just it's a mixture of egos, personalities, and politics between different teams, and we see it. It probably accounts for 10% of the senior medical workforce, also higher in other specialities, potentially, probably surgical teams more so. I think it also exists within the management structure of trusts. And the trust can't be seen to do badly, because that reflects badly on the board. And I think that's a real issue. I've been involved in 2 recent CQC inspections, and before the CQC come and visit, you hear a massive fanfare. How great are we? This is what we do well. Aren't we fantastic? Everyone, congratulate yourself. And then it's not the way it should be done. What we should be doing is saying, what do we do badly? What are we doing about it? The CQC shouldn't be interested in what they do well, but the trust management never take that view. They never want to show this is our dirty washing.
Yeah.
And that's how. So it's about the culture changes throughout all levels.
Agree. Completely agree.
The disruptive inspections are just awful. But, Michael, yeah, we missed your wonderful introduction because of the time pressures, but you're a senior clinician. You used to come to work with Florence Nightingale on the tandem.
We've had no truck with you. I think it's more or less the same point as we've just heard, which is you can focus down on the effector end of people doing things for the customer. But how about turning it the other way around and saying, where is evidence-based management? And Roy's ranting about the CQC, with which most of us agree, I think. There's so much evidence that the very senior management don't learn anything when we continue to get perverse incentives.
You know, all I would say about that is these things are not mutually exclusive. That one wants to get the improvements wherever they lie in the man. See, you sometimes see in organisations, big retailer, okay, so we can improve the offering, but what about the internet function? Or we can improve the internet function, what about the management? We can improve the management, but the marketing's a bit of right. If there are improvements that can be made at the level of clinicians, at the level of management, they should be done. And it should never be, well, we can't really do anything until the management changes. And just one other small thing. The other thing I get a lot from healthcare is that it's expensive to deliver changes. My sense is, and this is corroborated by a good report, is that the hospitals that have the strongest learning cultures have the best balance sheets. Low litigation costs, shorter hospital stays, less repeat visits. In other words, there's enough low-hanging fruit there to make the changes that can improve patient care economically
I would agree with you,
financing.
except our experience in talking to hospital boards is they don't seem to have much interest in data. They've got so much data there that they could use to improve what they're doing.
That's interesting. We've had
a whole drama. I mean, the NHS is the best data set in the world. We've been capturing data since the 5th of July 1948 and in hospitals since 1950. It's the world's best data set. It's a public health goldmine. We don't use it. Why? Because everybody's palavering about thinking somebody might find out I had the measles when I was 6 or I had a verruca on my dick. Well, who cares? We've got all this confidentiality thing all wrapped up in it. We try to do care.data. We can't do that because everybody's got to have an opt-out. I mean, if you talk about change the culture in the NHS, you've got to change the culture in the country to believe that actually big data is good data.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot to say about that. I mean, for the mathematicians here, you just want to guard against the false positives that often come out of big data analysis. But once
correlation's not causing.
Yeah, well, exactly, and that's a problem. I mean,
let's assume that we can.
I think I'm meeting one data company. I'm doing a lot of what. I mean, I work with Jeremy very closely with the introduction of the health safety investigation branch, the maternity, fast tracking compensation, learning from mistakes, lead tables. I think these are all good top-down changes. Data, I think there's a big body of work to be done in that space, and I know that there are companies that leverage data on, for example, adverse events, Datix. I think I'm meeting them tomorrow. Google were thinking of entering that space. They would be a good ally.
Actually, Google were very good to us. Our search engine is powered by Google on the website. And Terry went off and did a day's course with them. Right, okay, we've got lots of questions. I'll come to you now. I'm going to work around the room, if I may, in not chronological order, but you know what I mean. So I'm going to start with the blonde lady here.
My point.
Could you just say who you are? Give us your PIN number, where you work.
My name's Jude, and I'm a junior doctor. I've been working for 10 years.
Junior doctor? Why are you here? I thought you were all exhausted. Couldn't go out. Yeah.
And my point was just to follow on actually about what you said about this. Some of the types of senior clinicians is this idea that they're effort-driven. Actually, it's completely anecdotal. I don't have evidence for it, but my experience has been quite different. And I've seen a lot of my bosses being very, very traumatised actually by outcomes. I've seen them. I've had to sit with them when they've talked through whatever they've done. So, I wonder, is it linked to your comment about clinicians not always wanting to own the data of their mistakes, because unlike the golf swing and the ball goes out of play, it doesn't have a huge amount of ramifications, but if you've made a mistake and someone ends up in dialysis or dead or losing a limb, that can be quite difficult. So how do you bring those two things together?
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge it was a bit of a simplification if I said that all clinicians are that way. But I would strongly say that having looked at lots of different industries, healthcare definitely has a major problem with senior people admitting to their weaknesses to an extent even greater than I realised when writing Black Box Thinking. So it's I'm not saying it's everybody by any means, but there is a defensiveness in healthcare that is quite unparalleled in my experience of looking at other industries as an objective observer. But you're right, there are massive emotional ramifications too. And I think there needs to be sophistication. Remember when we were talking about the pilot who was so traumatised by what had gone wrong and being blamed for it that he killed himself? I mean, I've seen this in social work in a really horrible way. I mean, Sharon Baby P.
There's a very good passage in the book about Baby P, and I thought it was brave of you to write in the way that you did about that, because the world was on her case.
Yeah, and it's a classic example, by the way, of something terrible happening, and even though the mother's boyfriend and his brother were convicted, we wanted somebody else to blame. And Sharon Shoesmith and Maria Ward were vilified in the press. They turned their lives upside down. You know, Sharon Shoesmith's daughter was threatened with death. She started losing her hair. Sharon Shoesmith's life was pretty much obliterated. And I remember talking to journalists at the time, and I think this is a common feeling in the wider culture, that, you know what, if you really punish people sufficiently hard for their mistakes, you know, like you shoot doctors who make a mistake in theatre, and then they're going to up their game. It destroyed social work, because what started happening? They would start taking children out of their homes, even if there was nothing wrong, because they were worried it would cut. So in other words, they're making type 2 rather than type 1 errors.
And you make the point, they couldn't recruit.
Couldn't recruit.
They made social
people
work
started leaving the industry.
To
the court system couldn't cope with the new cases. The crucial thing is the number of children killed at the hands of their parents. More defensiveness amongst social workers, worried about reporting anything in case the number of children killed at the hands of their parents increased by 25% in the following year and remained higher for each of the next 3 years. You cannot create high performance through high blame. It is one of the biggest mistakes in management, because it looks decisive and it looks muscular and it is catastrophic. Only blame after a mature and meaningful investigation, not beforehand.
There's another interesting case which is sort of fizzling out now. It's Southern Health, where the BBC have been reporting deaths and so on. I mean, anyone who runs mental health services, particularly long-stay mental health services, will know these are really complicated issues, and you know, not all deaths do have to be reported. I mean, it's not easy. And I'm not in any sense defending anything that went wrong there, but I remember writing a piece about the difference between responsibility and culpability. You can be responsible for an organisation, but you're not necessarily culpable for everything the organisation does wrong. And the chief executive there, when certain alleged incidents occurred, she was away on maternity leave. So the role of management is made much more difficult by the external pressures. I'm going to quickly whip round. I know. Okay, so I'm going to come to you first. I've been rather too loquacious. Can you be brief?
Yeah. Audrey Tosh's Pavilion Health is a company, Australian company in the area of quality of data. The hospital payment systems recently has been swept by the idea of outcome-based payments, and in particular about hospital-acquired complications. And where there is a lot of talk about accurately coding hospital-acquired complications, which there is no blame, but you're going to be paid less as a hospital for episodes. That what do you say about that?
Depends on the consequences. If people feel that yes, introduce it, track the unintended consequences. Yeah, sometimes when you measure clinicians on bad outcomes, they just stop taking on the difficult cases. If you start disincentivizing people for hospital-acquired infections, they'll start covering up the information. You want to create openness and to track the unintended consequences, to adapt the system in the light of where you want it to go. But always remember there are unintended consequences of most interventions. What do you think? I mean, that would be my thought coming in from the outside.
I'm more into accurately coding those.
Right. Well, do you know, on the coding, you know, if you take adverse events and there's a lot to say about that.
Coding is often left to an exhausted junior doctor. There's nothing in it for him whether he codes it right or wrong. Coding goes off to some very experienced and very undervalued people in the organisation who really are the engine room to earn the money of the trusts, who often have got to traipse around the hospital trying to find the junior doctor who's on rota to say, what did you mean by this?
Yep.
It's a hopeless system.
Yep.
I mean, if
You've got
anything
an
is,
information system, don't you?
yes, you do. If anything is aching for a better information system, then that is it. And where better next to go to the maker of one of the finest information systems on earth, Norman Smith.
Thanks, Rolly. I think I might have seen in Black Box, you mentioned that the British government set aside 24 billion for litigation. Is that right? I made that up.
No, it's
sounds about right.
About right. 24 billion.
It's a reserve figure.
It's a reserve figure,
Yeah.
but just think about that for the budget for next year, etc. I'm fascinated by culture, and I'm fascinated at bringing in the public. So when a clinician makes a mistake, it's really difficult to say to that patient, I'm really sorry, you're affected for the rest of your life. I had a bad day, or I did something wrong. That's really difficult. I have worked with hospitals who have used information for refinement to educate surgeons for better performance, to a point where they either improved performance, and these did. The example became number 1 in the country at a certain thing and number 3 at another thing, independently verified. But then they also moved on to surgeons that couldn't perform. But I'm wondering about the trade-off for the patient, because I would love to see openness, and I do believe you can change culture, but the public has to be involved somehow, fairly recompensed for anything that's happened to them inadvertently, because we all make mistakes, we all have a bad day, and if we're going to get better, you can't get better by practicing and making live mistakes on live patients.
That's the New Zealand system, really, we're talking about.
Yeah, no, I agreed with everything until the last bit, I think. I wasn't sure I quite knew what you meant by that, but you're right, I think, that... so it's worth saying that, there's a bit of debate on this, you probably know, but there's an inverse correlation between error reporting and the amount of mistakes that are made overall. The organisations that report the most make the least mistakes because they're learning from their mistakes as they go along. That's why the Learning from Mistakes League table was
Virginia Mason.
Virginia Mason's the paradigm example, but
I'm going to move you on because I understand your time.
Yeah. Actually, it's probably have to be the last one.
Okay, well...
Can I just say, in mitigation, by the way, when I got on the train to come here today, Carlos Alberto, who scored what's considered the greatest goal in the history of football for Brazil in the 1970 World Cup final, died, and I've got to write 1,300 words by about 8:15. So I'm going to have to, as soon as I finish it, I'm going to have to not be able to stay in chat. I'm going to have to rush off. And it's one of the things about being a journalist is when a live story happens, you've got to be on it.
Right.
So apologies for that.
1,300 words, knocking it up. Right. Final question. This better be good.
Oh, God.
No pressure.
Firstly, thank you very much. It's been a
Pleasure. Thanks.
fascinating